The colonel pointed the training baton at the woman standing in the gymnasium doorway and said, "Sweetheart, the equipment closet's down the hall. You're in the wrong building." "I'm sorry, sir. Wrong room. I'll go." The front mat, 12 years of military service got me this position. 12 years. A girl like you wouldn't last 12 minutes. "I'm just looking for my orientation room, sir. My pension is bigger than your enlistment bonus. My name is on the wall of 3 command schools. You're a recruitment poster with a duffel bag." "I never said I belonged, sir. I'm leaving." "Good. Try not to steal the chalk targets on your way out." "Yes, sir." She had been on that campus for 35 minutes. She watched his demonstration for 6 seconds. She found the flaw in a technique he'd spent 11 years building his entire reputation on. That last part still gets me every time I think about it. I'm Cole Uncovers, and I dig up the stories that men with shiny medals on their chest really hope you never hear. The woman standing in that doorway, 35 minutes into her first day at one of the most exclusive tactical training academies on the East Coast. 35 minutes. Buckle in, because this one's a ride. Her name was Octavia Rain, 27 years old, fresh out of 6 years with the Army Military Police Corps, 2 deployments behind her, an honorable discharge in her file, and a duffel bag over one shoulder that still smelled faintly like the barracks she'd shipped out of 9 days earlier. She had applied for an entry-level instructor position at the Ashcombe Tactical Institute outside Richmond, Virginia, a private academy that trained corporate security details, executive protection officers, and, on a good year, a handful of federal contractors who needed refresher courses they couldn't get on the books anywhere else. It was the kind of place that printed its brochures on heavy cardstock and charged tuition that made veterans wince. The kind of place where half the instructors had never deployed anywhere more dangerous than a golf course in Scottsdale, and the other half had deployed exactly once, decades ago, and had been dining out on the story ever since. Octavia didn't know any of that yet. She just knew she'd gotten an email confirming an 8 a.m. interview in Conference Room C and the campus map they'd sent her, a low-resolution PDF printed at a gas station the night before because her hotel printer was broken, had a smudge right over the building number, and the smudge looked enough like a 3 that it could have been a 5, and she'd followed a stream of people in tactical polos into the wrong building entirely. The wrong building was the Founders Gymnasium. 400 folding chairs set up on risers, mats laid out across half the floor, a banner stretched above the stage that read, "Sto Technicu Demonstration, 11 years in the making, sponsored by the Ashcombe Board of Governors." She didn't know what the Stowe technique was. She didn't know who the man center stage was. She just knew she was 15 minutes early for an interview in a building she clearly wasn't in. The man on the stage was Colonel Bertram Stowe, retired, Director of Combatives at the Institute. 3 training manuals with his name on the spine, a consulting contract with 2 state police academies, a reputation, in certain circles, as the man who'd single-handedly modernized close-quarters disarmament training for the private sector, the kind of man who shook hands warmly with the board members in the front row and barked at the junior instructors standing along the wall, the kind of man who'd spent 11 years, by his own telling, in every interview, every keynote, every glossy magazine profile, refining a single signature joint lock disarmament sequence that he called, without irony, the Stowe lock. He'd announced 6 months earlier that he'd finally finished the definitive version, the one he was demonstrating today in front of the board, 24 corporate clients, and a video crew hired to film the Institute's recruitment reel for the next 5 years. He had not let anyone test it against him in advance. He'd said, with a small, satisfied smile, that he wanted the room to see it cold, the way it would work in the field. The room would see it cold, all right, just not the way he meant. Now, before I go further, If you've ever walked into a room and had someone decide who you were before you said a single word, you already know where this is going. Stay with me. It gets better. Octavia stood in the doorway for maybe 4 seconds, scanning the room, looking for an exit sign or a hallway number, anything that would point her back toward Conference Room C. That was when Colonel Stowe spotted her from the stage. A black woman in a plain gray Henley and jeans, duffel bag over one shoulder, standing uncertainly in the doorway of his gymnasium 12 minutes before his big moment, and decided, in the space of a single breath, exactly what kind of person she was. "Sweetheart, the equipment closet's down the hall. You're in the wrong building." A ripple of laughter went through the front rows. Not everyone, but enough. Octavia felt her face go warm, but her voice came out level, because 12 years of being underestimated by men in uniforms had taught her that level was the only register that worked. "I'm sorry, sir. Wrong room. I'll go." "The front mat," he said, not even looking at her now, already turning back to his assistant, adjusting the strap of his training pads. Then, almost as an afterthought, like he couldn't help himself, he said it again, louder this time, for the donors in the front row. "6 months ago, I told this board I'd finally finished the work of 11 years. 11 years, refining one technique until it couldn't be broken. A girl like you wouldn't understand that kind of patience in 6 lifetimes. So, shoo. I'm just looking for my orientation room, sir. My consulting fee for 1 weekend is bigger than your entire enlistment bonus. My name is on 3 training manuals in this building. You're a quota hire, with a duffel bag, standing in my demonstration. That one landed different. She felt it land. A couple of the instructors along the wall shifted their weight, looked at their boots. Nobody said anything. "I never said I belonged here, sir. I'm leaving." "Good. Try not to walk off with one of the practice knives on your way out." "Yes, sir." She turned to go. She had her hand on the door when a voice, young, nervous, belonging to a junior instructor near the back wall, whose name tag read trainee, Cooper, said just loud enough to carry, "Wait, she's wearing an MP unit pin. That's not a costume patch." Stowe didn't hear it, or didn't care to. He was already addressing the room, launching into his introduction. The 11 years, the breakthrough, the technique that had finally closed the gap between theory and field application. He had 2 volunteers from his own staff standing by as his demonstration partners, men he'd handpicked, men who knew exactly how hard to commit to an attack and exactly when to let the lock land clean, because nothing sells a technique faster than watching it work flawlessly on camera. Octavia had her hand on the door. She should have left. She tells people now when they ask that she almost did leave, that the rational, professional get-through. The interview part of her brain was already 3 hallways down, rehearsing her actual introduction for Conference Room C. But she stopped, because something in the technique itself had caught her eye in the 4 seconds she'd watched it. Something about the angle of the wrist control. Something that her body recognized before her brain finished the thought. The way 12 years of training rewires the part of you that notices things. She stood by the door and watched the whole demonstration. Colonel Stowe walked his volunteer through the sequence twice, slow and clean, narrating every joint angle for the board. A simulated knife attack, a redirect, a wrist lock that folded the attacker's arm up behind his own shoulder in one smooth motion, disarmament complete, applause from the donors. It was elegant. It was clearly the product of real expertise, real years of study. Nobody builds something this refined by accident. It was also, Octavia realized, watching it for the 3rd time, as he set up for the live-action version with full speed and real resistance, built on an assumption that only worked if the attacker's weight stayed forward through the whole exchange. If the attacker, a trained one, not a hand-picked volunteer playing along, shifted their base at the exact moment the wrist control engaged, the lock didn't just fail. It opened a window, a bad one. The kind of window that, in a real corridor with a real blade, ended very differently than a training mat with a rubber knife and a camera crew. She'd seen that exact failure mode before, not in a classroom. In a checkpoint in Kandahar province, 4 years earlier, when a detainee she was processing had used almost the identical base shift to nearly take her sidearm. She still had a thin scar along her left forearm from the follow-up disarm that had saved her life. She did not generally enjoy thinking about that scar in public. She also did not generally enjoy watching 400 people applaud something that could get a real protection officer killed. "Colonel," she said. The room didn't hear her the first time over the applause. She said it again, louder. "Colonel Stowe." He turned, irritation flickering across his face at the interruption, and saw the woman from the doorway still standing there, hand no longer on the door. "I told you to leave." "You did, sir. I'm trying. But your wrist control fails against a base shift. And I think you should know that before this goes in the recruitment reel." The laughter this time was sharper, meaner, and entirely aimed at her. The volunteer who just walked off the mat snickered. One of the board members actually said, "Oh, this is good," loud enough to be heard. Stowe's face went from irritation to something colder. "I'm sorry, what did you say, young lady?" Your lock assumes the attacker's weight stays committed forward through full extension. If they shift their base mid-lock, the rotation reverses on you, and you lose control of the weapon hand instead of the attacker. I've seen it happen. It put a knife 3 inches from my carotid artery once. A graduate-level hush settled over the front rows. Somewhere near the back, that same junior instructor, Cooper, whispered to the man next to him, "Wait, is she right?" "And you know this," Stowe said slowly, each word its own small weapon, "because you've trained 11 years in close-quarters combatives, because you've published manuals on it, because you've stood where I'm standing?" "No, sir. I know it because I almost died from it." You could have heard a coin drop in that gymnasium. Stowe recovered fast. Men like him always do. That's part of what gets them this far in the first place. He smiled the kind of smile that's built to read as confident on camera, gestured toward the empty mat with his training baton, and said, in the voice of a man who has just been handed exactly the kind of moment that ends badly for everyone except him, "Then why don't you show us, right now, in front of the board?" It wasn't an invitation. Everyone in that room understood. It was a public execution dressed up as a teaching moment. He expected her to freeze, to fumble, to confirm every assumption he'd made about her in the doorway 4 minutes earlier. The board members were already exchanging glances, anticipating the kind of viral, adjacent moment that makes for good donor dinner conversation later. "Do you remember when that girl tried to correct the colonel, and it went exactly how you'd expect?" Octavia set her duffel bag down by the door. "May I borrow a training knife, sir?" He tossed her the rubber blade himself. Hard, the way you throw something at someone you want to watch fumble. She caught it clean, out of the air, without looking like she'd had to try. What happened next took 11 seconds. I've had people who study this stuff, frame by frame on the slowed-down clip that ended up circulating later, and yes, we'll get to that, and they all land on roughly the same count. 11 seconds. Stowe came at her with the same committed forward attack he'd run twice already. Full speed this time, the way you'd attack a colleague you respected enough to go hard on, or a stranger you wanted to embarrass. Octavia let the wrist control engage exactly the way it was designed to. Let him feel it lock. Let the room see the photo-perfect angle he'd spent 11 years perfecting. And then, at the precise half-second his feet headed forward into the finishing rotation, she shifted her own base 8 inches to the left, dropped her hip, and reversed the entire structure of the lock back onto his own wrist. He didn't go down clean. He went down hard, off balance, one knee hitting the mat, the rubber knife clattering somewhere past the front row, his own technique folded back against him in a configuration he had genuinely never seen before, because nobody who trained under him had ever hit it full resistance with real intent. The gymnasium was silent for one full second. Then it was not silent at all. I won't pretend every single person in that room turned on him instantly, because that's not how rooms work, and that's not how this story actually went. A few of the donors laughed, assuming it was staged, part of the show. A couple of the senior instructors along the wall looked deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. The look of men recalculating a decade of professional deference in real time. But trainee Cooper, the one who'd whispered, "Is she right?" was already on his feet near the back wall, and so was a woman 3 rows up, who I'll get to in a second. And within about 4 seconds, the applause that started was not the polite donor applause from before. It was the real kind. Stowe got to his feet slowly, jaw tight, training pads still strapped to his forearms, and said the only thing a man like that has left to say in that exact moment: "Pure luck. Try it again." She did. Same result, 4 seconds faster. Again. Third time, he didn't even get his weight fully forward before she'd already redirected it. He stopped asking after that. The woman 3 rows up who'd started applauding. I should tell you about her now, because she matters. Her name was Director Whitlock. No, I'm going to stop myself there, because some names in this story I'm changing on purpose, for reasons that'll make sense by the end. And I'd rather just tell you what she did than worry about getting tangled up in who she officially was. What you need to know is that she ran the Institute's Curriculum Oversight Committee. She had a clipboard in her lap, and she had watched 11 years of Stowe's reputation get quietly, completely dismantled in under a minute on a gym mat, in front of the people who funded his entire department. She wrote something on that clipboard. She did not stop writing for a while. Stowe tried to recover the room. Men like that always try. He laughed it off, said something about spirited demonstrations, tried to pivot back to his prepared remarks about the 11-year journey, the dedication, the legacy. But you could feel the room's attention had physically relocated. Every eye that had been on him 30 seconds earlier was now on the woman in the gray Henley, standing at the edge of the mat, breathing easy, like none of this had cost her anything at all. "What's your name?" the clipboard woman called out from the 3rd row. "Octavia Rain, ma'am. I have an interview in conference room C in about 6 minutes. I think I'm in the wrong building." That got the first real laugh of the day, the kind that comes from genuine release, not cruelty. "I don't think you are," the woman said. Now here's the thing about institutions like Ashcombe, and honestly, about most institutions, period. They don't fall apart in one dramatic afternoon just because a colonel got embarrassed on a mat in front of the board. What actually happens is slower, and in some ways, more interesting. And it's the part most stories like this skip over because it's not as satisfying as a single knockout moment. So let me tell you what actually happened over the following 6 weeks, because I think you'll find it's worth knowing. The video crew that had been hired to film the recruitment reel had of course captured the entire demonstration. All 3 reversals, all 3 times. Stowe hit the mat. All 3 times, he said, again in a voice getting tighter and tighter. The official footage was never supposed to leave the building. Someone leaked 9 seconds of it to a private security forum 2 days later. Within a week, it had made its way to a veterans channel with about 500,000 subscribers, with the caption, "11 years of training broken in 11 seconds by a girl he tried to throw out of the building." The internet did what the internet does. By the end of that week, Octavia Rain's name had appeared in 3 trade publications, none of which she'd spoken to, all of which had somehow obtained her service record. Honorably, mostly, though one outlet got her deployment dates wrong, which she found more annoying than the rest of it combined. Ashcombe's board did not love the attention, at first, because boards rarely love any attention that isn't pre-approved and lit correctly. There was a closed-door meeting. There was a second closed-door meeting. There was, eventually, a quietly worded press release announcing that Colonel Bertram Stowe was stepping back from his instructional duties to pursue other opportunities, which is the institutional version of a funeral that nobody's allowed to cry at. What the press release didn't say, what only came out later, in the curriculum review the clipboard woman had started writing on that very first day, was that the investigation into Stowe's 11 years of refinement turned up something uglier than just a flawed wrist lock. 2 former trainees, both of them women, both of them quietly let go from the program years earlier under vague performance complaints, came forward once the video went public. Their accounts didn't have anything to do with the technique itself. They had to do with how Stowe ran his classroom, who he gave second chances to and who he didn't, whose mistakes got written up and whose got laughed off. None of it had ever been the kind of thing that gets formally investigated on its own. It took 11 seconds on a gym mat, captured on someone else's camera, to make 4 years of quiet pattern suddenly visible to people who'd had every opportunity to see it before and simply hadn't looked. That was the most expensive 11 seconds of Bertram Stowe's career. It didn't undo anything he'd actually built. The manuals with his name on the spine still existed. The state police contracts he'd consulted on weren't retroactively voided. But it was on the record now, permanently, in a way that no amount of consulting fees or keynote speeches could quietly walk back. 6 months later, the Stowe technique was formally retired from the Institute's curriculum. In its place, the Combatives Department adopted a revised disarmament sequence, co-developed and field-tested by 2 instructors, published under both their names in the Institute's internal training journal. Base Shift Counter to Standard Wrist Lock Disarmament, a field-validated revision. The lead author was O. Rain. The second author was a woman named Castellanos, Master Sergeant Ruben Castellanos' daughter, actually, a fellow instructor who'd been one of the 2 people clapping loudest that first day, and who I'd tell you more about if this story had room for 2 heroes instead of 1. The acknowledgments thanked the clipboard woman by her actual title, Director of Curriculum Oversight, and a junior trainee named Cooper, who'd apparently spent his next 6 weekends helping run the field tests on his own time because he wanted to be part of getting it right. The manual ran 11 pages, not 140 like Stowe's original. 11 pages, because once you had the correct base mechanics, the rest of it really was just standard application. Stowe's name was not on it. By then, Stowe's name was no longer on the building directory at all. I'm telling you this story because I needed to tell it. I've watched too many people who actually know what they're talking about get talked over by people who've simply gotten very good at sounding like they do. If you've ever walked into the wrong room and been told, in one way or another, that you didn't belong there, I see you. The work always knows the truth eventually. So do the people who are actually paying attention. So what does a woman like that say 6 months later, standing on the exact same stage where this whole thing started? 6 months later, she stood on that same stage again. The gymnasium was packed, different crowd this time. New recruit class, mostly, plus a handful of high schoolers bust in from a public safety mentorship program the clipboard woman had personally lobbied the board to fund. Octavia wore plain black training fatigues this time, instead of the gray Henley, but the duffel bag sitting by the edge of the mat was the same one. A little more worn at the seams now, an army surplus tag still clipped to the strap that she'd never quite gotten around to removing. She didn't demonstrate anything fancy. She picked up a single rubber training knife, set it down on a table at center stage, and turned to face the room. Hi, I'm Octavia. People keep asking me how I broke an 11-year technique in 11 seconds. So I want to tell you the truth. I didn't break it in 11 seconds. I recognized it in 4. The other 7 were just me deciding whether I was allowed to say something out loud. The technique wasn't the hard part. It never is. Being willing to open your mouth in a room that's already decided what you are, that's the hard part. If any of you in this room have ever noticed something nobody else caught, and you've ever been told, directly or otherwise, that you don't belong in rooms like this one, I want you to know 2 things. 1. You do. 2. Don't wait for someone to hand you permission before you say what you saw. She set the training knife back down on the table. She picked her duffel bag up off the floor, the army tag swinging gently against the canvas. It was never about the 11 seconds on that mat. It was never about proving anything to anyone in that front row. It was about getting the technique right, so the next person who has to use it under real pressure doesn't end up with a scar like mine. That's it. That's the whole thing. She walked off the stage. Trainee Cooper, no longer a trainee, held the door for her on her way out. Octavia still drives the same beat-up truck she had on her first day in Richmond. She still corrects people, politely and briefly, when they assume she's lost in a building she's clearly supposed to be in. Then she goes back to work, because the work was never about him. It was never about proving a point to a man who'd already made up his mind before she said a word. It was about getting it right. She just happened to see it first.